Hello again, and welcome to Module 6 of the Microsoft Certified Azure Administrator training course. In today's module, we're going to take a look at some of the exam lab simulations that you're likely to come across in the exam and show you how to prepare to get the skills needed to be able to answer those questions and complete the labs. In today's agenda, we're going to go through 3 example tasks that you might come up against in the Azure exam. By going through these task situations, I'm hoping you can get a feel for what the lab exam simulations look like and feel like. And also I'm going to give you some preparation steps to go away to make sure if a question like this comes up, you know how to answer them. As always, there'll be a quick recap on course housekeeping frequently asked questions at the end. A lot of the feedback on the first 2 iterations of Azure certification exams were that they were testing skills that were almost irrelevant to the workplace. One of the ways Microsoft has responded from that and made the world a much better place for us is by including lab exam simulations. What that means is during the exam, the normal flow of multiple choice questions will be interrupted and you'll be given a briefing, essentially a set of tasks or an outcome that you need to configure. So what's going to happen then is Azure is going to open up, so the exam software is going to open up the Azure portal for you and give you a set of objectives that you need to achieve. You then go in through the portal. If it's asking you to build some virtual machines, you build the VMs. If it's asking you to modify network configuration, you modify the network configuration. Now, it's very easy to feel a bit put off by these exam simulation questions. They're actually very fairly graded. So if it's giving you an objective, you are judged by whether or not you meet the end requirements. So what that means, if you go into the portal and you accidentally create 5 virtual machines, then you delete those virtual machines, then you create the virtual machines you actually needed in the first place and configure it correctly, you'll only be judged on the final outcome, whether the solution that you've put in place meets the requirements. They don't take any points off you if you're getting stuff wrong. They don't take any points off you if you're going and using the wrong process, as long as you correct your course of actions. What matters is that what you build meets their needs. So don't worry too much about this. It's not an unforgiving experience whatsoever. The labs are not timed separately from the main exam. That means when you go into the exam, you've got to manage your time quite carefully. And the answer to that is really generally not to procrastinate. If you're going to get 2 or 3 of these labs in an exam, it can be a lot of work that needs to be done. So you have to make sure you proceed through it smoothly and confidently. One of the things you'll be given is a technical support reference for the lab. Usually it's in the form of a 7-digit number. So it's important to make sure that that's accessible if you need to do troubleshooting. I know some people have recently had some problems with the labs malfunctioning and maybe they just get a white screen when it starts up. If that happens to you in the exam, either speak to the training administrators, or speak to the lab proctor if you're doing it as a distance exam. What they'll do is they'll sort out getting it recovered, and then you can do one of 2 things. One is to have Microsoft fix the problem, or the other one is just start the exam again. Let's take a look at a lab exercise that you might come across in the Azure AZ-103 exam. This is a pretty good example of a sort of task that you might be briefed with in one of the lab exercises. You'll be given a briefing that says something like this. You need to deploy 2 Azure virtual machines named VM1003A and VM1003B based on the Ubuntu server image. This deployment must meet the following requirements. We must provide a service level agreement of 99.95%, and we also must use managed disks. What should we do in the Azure portal? So the first thing we need to do is just go through and break down that task and try and build up an understanding of exactly what the question is asking us to do. So first of all, the exam has asked us to build 2 virtual machines, and it's given the names of those virtual machines that it wants us to build. It's very important that we use those names when we create the virtual machines. Also as well, it's told us it wants us to use the Ubuntu server image as well. Now don't worry, we're not going to have to log on to the Ubuntu servers. We just have to make sure when we create these machines from the marketplace, we use the marketplace Ubuntu server image to do that. Let's look at those requirements. It's asking us to provide a service level agreement of 99.95%. If you think back to your training in Module 2, you'll remember we discussed that we had several ways of providing an SLA from Microsoft. It's asking us to deploy the solution with managed disks, but also as well it's asking us to provide a 99.95% SLA. By just using managed disks alone, we'd only get a 99.9% SLA. If we want an SLA of 99.95%, if you'll remember, we need to deploy 2 virtual machines and add them to an availability set. So one other thing to watch out for here, we're not building an availability zone because it's not asking for 4 nines of availability. So the solution we're going to build here is an availability set containing 2 virtual machines. And those virtual machines need to use managed disks. So it's important when you come across questions like this, you drill into what the question is asking you. There's some information you need to take away from that. Obviously the name of the virtual machines, what image to deploy, yeah, and it's giving these requirements of how it's supposed to be built. Now you have to interpret these requirements, which as a Microsoft certified Azure administrator, you should be able to do and decide the actual solution you're going to build. So let's have a think about how we'd meet that requirement. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to go and create an availability set. Now, if you'll remember from our training, one of the things we can't do with an availability set is add a virtual machine to it once the virtual machine has been provisioned. So personally, what I would do is go into the portal and create an availability set, choose a location for it and so forth. Then I would go and deploy my virtual machines and add them to that availability set as we build the VMs. Then what I would do is go into the marketplace and create virtual machines based on the Ubuntu image. I would make sure that when I configure the names of those machines, I use the 2 names provided in the question. That's VM103A and VM104. So what VM103B. Once we've created those virtual machines, as part of the setup for those virtual machines, I'm adding them to the availability set. We then basically can let the virtual machines build out, and as long as they're added to the availability set, we should be fine. Now remember, we don't need to go through any special instructions these days to make the virtual machines with managed disks. That should be the default. But what you do want to be doing is making sure you check on the storage page of the virtual machine settings that we are indeed using managed disks for the storage. And that configuration should give us what we need to pass that question. So obviously, to be able to give the exam simulation task the answers it needs, you probably want to get some practice in. So there's a tutorial available online which will walk you through creating and deploying highly available virtual machines in the Azure portal. Now, if you follow this URL here, that'll take you to that. Basically, I went online and just Googled Azure step-by-step availability sets. When you're sitting the exam, there's nothing stopping you creating an availability set using PowerShell or using the command line interface. As long as you can remember the exact steps and the exact commands you're going to have to enter into there. Personally, I find it easier just to use the Azure portal in here. Now remember, the question hasn't specifically said whether you should use the portal or whether you should use the CLI or whether you should use PowerShell. So we're quite happy, the exam question is quite happy for us to do this in the portal as long as we're giving it the configuration that we like. So if you want to get ready to be able to ace an exam simulation task like that, get online, have a look at that tutorial, run through it in your lab environment and give it a couple of goes. One of the areas that comes up quite frequently on the AZ-103 lab exercises is creating and configuring storage accounts. Let's take a look at a typical question that might come up from there and understand how to handle it. In this simulation, you need to create a storage account named corpdata 9172795N2, and the solution has to meet the following requirements. We need to make sure that the documents are accessible via drive mappings from an Azure virtual machine that runs on Windows Server 2016. We must provide the highest possible redundancy for the documents, and we also need to minimize our storage costs. What should we do in the Azure portal? Okay, well, let's break this question down and move through it. Looking back through those requirements, the first one was ensure that documents are accessible via drive mappings from the Azure virtual machines that run Windows Server 2016. Now that tells me that I want to be using the latest version of storage accounts, so I would default to using a storage account v2 anyway, unless there was some kind of requirement telling me to use one of the other types. The other thing that question is telling me to do is that I need to create a file container within that storage account. The question has asked me to provide the highest possible level of redundancy for the documents. So that means I'm going to select read accessible GRS, high availability for that storage account. And finally, it's asked me to minimize storage access costs. If you think back to the Azure storage module, we had the choice of data tiers. What we could do is if it was data that was basically going to be archived, we could make the capacity very cheap, but just pay a premium for accessing each time we access that data. So that was using the Coure or the archive tier. Here we want to minimize the storage access costs, not the storage overall costs. So what we'll do here is we'll use the hot data tier. That means it'll be pretty much a normal storage account. We'll only pay for the data that we consume in there. So how are we going to go about building this out? Okay, well, remember, we need to build a storage account. So we go into the Azure, we go into the marketplace and we create the storage account. When we go in there, we need to choose what type of storage account. So we'll choose a storage account version 2. There's no reason to create a legacy storage account when you look at the functional requirements in there. So let's use the latest one. Then we need to choose which subscription the storage account is going to be held in. We need to give the storage account a name, so it's important to use the name that was quoted in the question. So we're going to call it Corp Data 917295N2. Then what I'm going to do is go into the account type selection. I'm going to tell it it's going to use a V2 general purpose storage account, which is ideal for this scenario. It's recommended. I mean, a V2 general purpose account is kind of your default go-to storage account in Azure these days. It gives us the ability to create all the kind of container types like files, blob storage, table, and queue storage. So this is the one for us. That's going to give us the lowest cost of capacity per gigabyte. Then finally, what I'm going to do there is for the replication method, I am going to choose read access geo-redundant storage. Remember, the question was asking me to provide the highest possible redundancy for it, so I'm going to choose that option. And basically what I'm going to do that, and then what I'm going to do is have GRS duplicate my storage into the secondary data location that goes near the data center where this has been deployed. So if the question is asking me to deploy this in US West, I'm going to deploy it in the partner site for US West, which is US Central. Also as well, if it was in the UK, I would say go with UK North, UK South. So this exam question is actually getting you to prove that you know a few things here. You're able to select the type of storage account. We have a good understanding of what file storage containers are, and also as well, we're going to configure read access. So read access geo-resilient storage. Just as with the previous question, the exam has not told us that we need to use the command line interface. It's not told us we need to use PowerShell. It just wants us to put the configuration in place. So my recommendation here would be to keep life nice and simple and use the Azure portal to achieve this. That way you're not going to have to try and figure out commands on the fly in the exam. So there is a tutorial online which is basically called create a storage account. If you go to this URL, follow the instructions through here, get used to creating storage accounts with geo-replication, read accessible geolocation, and creating the different types of storage container that's required as well. So maybe file, blob, table, and so forth. And just get some hands-on practice for that. So when you come into the exam, you're familiar with the experience of creating a storage account, and you're not going to run into any problems because it should be quite a familiar experience if you've run through these practice labs a couple of times. Let's now take a look at a typical lab exercise briefing to do with networking. So for this task, the briefing that's been provided is that we need to configure an existing virtual machine called VM1 to be accessible from the internet. To do that, we're going to need to add a public IP address to the network interface that's used by VM1. What should we do from the Azure portal? So as you can see, the question is asking us to prove that we know how to create a public or a private IP address in Azure. And here are the steps we follow if we're going to do that out through the portal. So start off by going and finding the virtual machine they've specified. I'd like to use the filter box. So I would click on virtual machines and just type VM1 in the, or whatever the name of the virtual machine is in the filter box. Then I'd go into the properties of that virtual machine. Yeah, I would click under the network settings and add an IP address to it. Specify that it was a public IP address. Now the question hasn't told us whether we need to create a static IP address or a dynamic IP address. I would suggest that what you want to do in circumstances like that is keep it as simple as possible. So I would suggest just using a dynamic IP address. If the question had said use a static or a dynamic, do whatever it tells you. And then in the next page, what you want to do is select the IP configurations and create the public IP address. Remember, creating the IP address is only part of the story. Because there'll be a network security group attached to that public IP address, we need to make sure that we're only allowing that we are actually publishing the correct ports for that virtual machine. Now we could just create an open public IP address and allow it to connect over any port we like, but if there's a network security group in place, what we need to do is make sure that it's accessible either by remote desktop protocol or by HTTP or HTTPS, depending on what the question has asked you to do. As you can see, yet again, the question has not told us to use a particular tool to implement this configuration. So we could open up the Azure portal and use the command line interface or the PowerShell console from within the Azure portal. But I would suggest, again, let's keep this simple. Let's just use the portal. Let's work with the GUI. If you want to get ready to be able to sit and pass an exam simulation task like this, take a look at this URL. There is a step-by-step tutorial in there that tells you how to add public IP addresses through the portal to a virtual machine. Get used to doing it with a couple of different configurations. Be used to being able to configure a virtual machine with a public IP address with both static and dynamic IP addresses. Get used to being able to create them and configuring the network security group to say allow external machines to connect over RDP or to allow it to connect over HTTP, HTTPS or secure sockets layer, just so you're aware of a couple of different variants of how to configure that. That way, if you go through that exercise a couple of times, when you hit the AZ-103 exam, you're not going to be stunned by this. You're going to pretty much know how to go ahead and do this stuff. That's all for today. Good luck with going through those exam preparation activities that I've set you there. This really is about getting hands-on experience. If you go through those 3 scenarios, you're going to find yourself very well prepared to sit and do well in this exam. So, thanks very much for listening to this, and I look forward to speaking to you on the next module.